All right, strap in everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a situation that's about as straightforward as a maze made of cooked spaghetti, the resurgence of Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan.
Or as everyone's calling them these days, the TTP.
The TTP. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, didn't we already cover this? Didn't this whole thing get sorted out? And you wouldn't be wrong to think that, but...
Here's the catch.
Yeah, there's always a catch. Since the Afghan Taliban took over Afghanistan back in 2021.
Yeah, 2021.
The TTP's been staging this kind of alarming comeback.
That's a real head-scratcher, especially for Pakistan. They went all in, back in the Afghan Taliban.
Hoping for, what, a little favor in return? Like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal?
Exactly. They figured, hey, you guys help us keep a lid on the whole terrorism thing and we'll smooth your transition into power. It was supposed to be this win-win.
But, well, let's just say it didn't quite pan out that way, did it?
Nope. Not even close. In fact, you could say it had the opposite effect. The TTP got emboldened, started launching more attacks, and basically became a bigger thorn in Pakistan's side.
And that's exactly what we're dissecting today, folks, our scalpel for this deep dive. A pretty thought-provoking academic paper titled Resurrection of Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan Amidst Afghan Regime's Indifference, Threats to Intersectional Security Strands in the Region.
This article goes beyond just ticking off a list of attacks, though. It digs into how this resurgence is shaking things up, impacting everything from politics and the economy.
All the way down to people just trying to live their lives.
Exactly. Even looking at how different communities are affected, because it's not a one-size-fits-all impact,
Yeah,
right?
because like terrorism's throwing this rock into a pond and you've got these ripples spreading out, messing with everything in their path.
Perfect analogy. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back for a sec. Just a quick refresher. TTP 101. What are we dealing with here?
Okay, so picture this. It's 2007, and you've got this group, the TTP, basically taking a page out of the Afghan Taliban's playbook. Their goal: they want to set up a strict Islamic state right smack dab in the middle of Pakistan.
Ambitious, to say the least.
And their methods, well, let's just say they're not exactly handing out peace prizes. We're talking bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, you name it.
The whole shebang.
Exactly. And this is where that whole security dilemma thing we mentioned earlier really rears its ugly head. Pakistan thought aligning with the Afghan Taliban would be like, you know, the safety net.
A buffer zone.
Yeah, a buffer zone. But instead, they ended up kind of fanning the flames and empowering the very group they were trying to contain.
Oops.
Hold on a second, though. Back up a bit. For those of us who don't have security dilemma tattooed on our brains, break it down for us. What exactly are we talking about here?
Okay, so think of it like this. You decide to build a big, strong fence around your house because you want to feel safer. Your neighbor sees this and thinks, whoa, hold on, they must be worried about something I don't know about. Better build an even bigger fence just in case.
Yeah.
And suddenly, everyone's feeling less safe, even though no one actually intended to start any trouble.
So Pakistan built their metaphorical fence by siding with the Afghan Taliban, and now they're finding out that it's kind of made them a bigger target.
Bingo. And here's the kicker. There's a whole lot of historical baggage between Pakistan and Afghanistan. We're talking border disputes like the Durand Line, the whole Pashtunistan issue. It's basically a recipe for tension and distrust.
It's like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And when you toss in the Afghan Taliban's support for the TTP, well, let's just say it's not exactly the recipe for peaceful coexistence.
So we've got this tinderbox of historical tension just waiting to ignite. And then the TTP comes along and strikes a match.
And things get messy.
Paint us a picture, though. Just how bad have things gotten since 2021? Hit us with the stats.
Well, let's just say the situation's escalated, like dramatically. In 2021, the TTP launched 282 attacks, killing 509 security personnel. But by 2022, those numbers jumped to 367 attacks and a staggering 1,015 casualties.
Wow.
And get this, between August 2021 and April 2023, attacks shot up by 73% and deaths. Those skyrocketed by 138%. We're talking about a serious uptick in violence here.
Okay, those numbers definitely paint a grim picture. Were there any specific attacks that really hammered home the point that the TTP is not messing around?
Oh, there were a couple that made everyone sit up and take notice. Take July 2024, for instance. The TTP launched an attack on a military cantonment in Bano. Now, these cantonments are basically fortresses, right? Super secure areas.
Yeah, they're not exactly easy targets.
So for the TTP to breach one, it sent shockwaves through the region. It was a message. They were saying, we can hit you anywhere, anytime.
It's like strolling into Fort Knox and making off with the gold. Definitely a power move.
Right. And then there was that other one in March 2024, a suicide bombing that killed 5 Chinese workers and their Pakistani driver.
Yeah, that one made headlines all over the world.
It was a game changer, and not just because of the tragic loss of life. This attack had ripple effects way beyond the immediate casualties.
This is where things get even more interesting, right? Because that attack wasn't just about violence, it had economic implications, even geopolitical shockwaves.
Absolutely. It exposed the vulnerability of foreign investment in the region, particularly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, this massive project China's pouring billions into. It basically threw a wrench in the whole vision of trade and connectivity.
So suddenly this grand plan is looking a lot riskier.
And when you factor in the already tense relationship between China and India, well, you've got a recipe for regional instability that could have global consequences.
So it's not just a local problem anymore. This TTP resurgence has the potential to shake things up on a much larger scale. But before we go full-blown international relations wonk on this, let's bring it back to the human element.
Right, because as we said earlier, terrorism doesn't hit everyone the same way.
Okay.
This is where the concept of intersectional security comes into play.
Okay, full disclosure. Sometimes when I hear intersectional security, my brain does a little bit of a system reboot. Can you break it down for us non-experts? What does it actually mean in the context of the TTP?
Sure. Think of it like this. Terrorism isn't just about bombs and bullets. It's about disrupting every facet of life, every sense of security. Imagine a spider web, each strand representing a different area: political security, military security, economic security, human security, and cultural security. The TTP's actions are like tugging on each of these strands, sending ripples of instability across the entire web.
Okay, I'm starting to get the visual. So walk us through each of these strands, starting with political security. How exactly is the TTP messing with Pakistan's political scene?
Imagine you're a political leader in Pakistan. You're trying to build consensus, push through reforms, keep the country running. But the TTP's there, constantly looming over you, threatening you, disrupting your plans, maybe even going after your allies. It creates this atmosphere of paranoia and distrust, making effective governance next to impossible.
Yeah, that's going to make it tough to get anything done.
It's like trying to build a house of cards in a windstorm.
Yeah.
Not exactly conducive to stability.
And what about elections? How is the TTP affecting the democratic process in Pakistan?
Well, put yourself in the shoes of a citizen living in a TTP-controlled area. Are you really going to risk your life to vote? Are you going to believe the results are legitimate when there's this group that could be intimidating voters or rigging the whole system?
So basically, the TTP is chipping away at the very foundation of democracy in Pakistan, creating this space where fear and coercion replace free choice and political participation.
Exactly. And that, in turn, can create even more instability and open the door for even more extreme ideologies to take root. It's a vicious cycle.
And speaking of vicious cycles, we can't forget about the economic fallout from this whole TTP resurgence. We touched on how attacks on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor are spooking investors.
Yeah, that's a big one.
But zoom out for a sec. How is this instability affecting everyday Pakistanis, those just trying to make ends meet? Well, picture yourself as a shopkeeper whose business got caught in a bombing, or a farmer whose crops were destroyed, or a parent who can't even send their kids to school because it's been targeted. It's not just about the immediate damage, it's the long-term economic hardship that ripples through these communities.
Like a domino effect, right? One economic setback leads to another, and it just creates this downward spiral that's hard to break free from.
And who gets hit hardest? Those who are already struggling, those living on the margins. They get pushed further into poverty, their opportunities shrink, and it creates this breeding ground for resentment and despair.
Which tragically can make them more susceptible to these extremist ideologies in the first place.
It's a heartbreaking cycle, a pattern we see all too often in regions grappling with conflict and instability.
Okay, so we've talked stats, we've talked about political maneuvering, but we can't lose sight of the human cost here. This is about real people whose lives are being turned upside down by this violence. Absolutely. We're talking about families ripped apart, children who've witnessed unimaginable things, entire communities living in fear. The trauma inflicted by the TTP's actions is immeasurable.
And as we mentioned earlier, some communities are bearing the brunt of this more than others. We talked about the Hazara Shiite community.
Right, they've been targeted relentlessly.
But they're not the only ones facing persecution, are they?
Sadly not. The TTP has a long and brutal history of going after religious minorities, ethnic groups, anyone who dares to question their ideology. They've attacked schools, hospitals, mosques, even funerals.
They're not exactly discriminating, are they?
Nope. Their goal is to sow fear and division, to crush any kind of dissent, and force their worldview on everyone else.
It's a stark reminder of just how brutal and intolerant these extremist ideologies can be. And we can't forget that even the efforts to fight back against the TTP, to counter their attacks, can sometimes have unintended consequences for innocent people.
Right, it's a double-edged sword.
It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
It is. Counterterrorism operations, while necessary, can sometimes lead to collateral damage, displacement, even human rights abuses. It requires this incredibly delicate balance, considering the potential harm to non-combatants.
And this brings us right back to that idea of intersectional security. How different forms of insecurity intertwine and compound each other.
Exactly. When a school is bombed, it's not just an attack on education. It's a blow to human security, economic security, cultural security, all at the same time.
It creates this ripple effect that just keeps spreading.
It touches every aspect of life. And as we talked about earlier, women are particularly vulnerable in this situation. Their lives, their rights, even their very existence are under threat from the TTP's ideology. Can you expand on that a bit? Give us some concrete examples of how they're being impacted.
I mean, imagine being a young girl who dreams of becoming a doctor, a teacher, anything really, only to be told you're not allowed to go to school. Or being a woman who's forced to wear a burqa, cover her face, denied the freedom to express herself, to even walk down the street without fearing harassment or violence.
It's about control, isn't it?
It's a deliberate attempt to erase their identities, to silence them, to confine them to a life of subservience.
Exactly. The TTP's ideology sees women as possessions, objects to be controlled and subjugated. They're denied basic human rights, their movements are restricted, their access to education and healthcare is limited, and they live under this constant threat of violence.
It's a stark reminder of just how vital it is to fight for women's rights, not just in Pakistan, but everywhere. These aren't just abstract concepts. These are fundamental human rights that need to be protected and upheld universally.
Couldn't agree more. And empowering women is about more than just fairness or social justice. It's crucial for peace and security. When women are educated, when they have opportunities, when their voices are heard, societies become more stable, more prosperous, and more resilient to these extremist ideologies.
So what we have here is a situation where the TTP is tugging at every single strand of Pakistan's security web, creating this ripple effect of instability that just keeps spreading outward. And lurking in the background, we've got the Afghan Taliban, this powerful force that seems to be playing both sides.
And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
We'll delve into the Afghan Taliban's role, trying to understand why they seem reluctant to crack down on the TTP and what all this means for peace and security in the region.
It's like a puzzle within a puzzle, figuring out how all the pieces fit together.
And we'll try to sort out those pieces next time.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
All right, welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive. Last time, we really got into the nitty-gritty of this whole TTP resurgence. We talked about how Pakistan's stuck in this security dilemma and how the TTP is messing with everything from politics to, well, just daily life for regular people.
Right, we even brought up that intersectional security idea.
The spider web analogy.
Exactly, how the TTP is yanking on different strands of Pakistan's security, causing disruptions all over the place.
And it's not just about like military moves or political chess matches. It's about how terrorism impacts everyday life, the economy, even the cultural fabric of a society.
And to really understand the nuances of it all, we need to kind of zoom in on those individual strands, see how they intersect and how they feed off each other.
Okay, so let's untangle this web a bit, shall we? We talked about political security earlier, how the TTP is creating this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, making it tough for the government to function.
Right. It's like constantly looking over your shoulder.
But how does that actually play out in a country like Pakistan, which, let's be honest, already has a history of political instability?
Well, imagine you're a leader, right? You're trying to build consensus, implement reforms, just keep the country running smoothly. But you've got the TTP breathing down your neck, threatening you, messing with your plans, maybe even targeting your allies. It creates this constant sense of paranoia and distrust, making effective governance almost impossible.
Yeah, no one's going to get any work done if they're constantly worried about, getting blown up.
Exactly. It's like trying to play a game of chess when someone keeps knocking over the pieces.
And then there's the whole impact on elections. How's the TTP affecting the democratic process in Pakistan?
Think about it. You're a citizen. You live in a region where the TTP is active. Are you really going to risk your life just to go vote?
I mean, would you?
And even if you do vote, are you going to trust the results? Especially when you know this group could be intimidating voters or even rigging the whole thing.
So the TTP is basically chipping away at the very foundation of democracy in Pakistan, replacing free will and participation with fear and coercion.
Exactly. And that, in turn, creates even more instability, opens the door for more extreme ideologies to take root. It's a dangerous cycle.
And speaking of dangerous cycles, we can't forget about the economic fallout from all of this. We mentioned how attacks on the China-Pakistan economic corridor are making investors nervous.
Yeah, no one wants to put their money into a region that's considered a high-risk zone.
But let's zoom out a bit. How is this instability affecting everyday people in Pakistan?
Imagine you're a shopkeeper in a market that's been bombed, or a farmer whose crops have been destroyed, or a parent whose kid's school has been targeted by the TTP. Terrorism doesn't just cause immediate damage, it creates this ripple effect of economic hardship that can last for generations.
It's like a domino effect, right? One economic setback leads to another, and it's just this downward spiral that's so hard to escape.
And the people who get hit the hardest, the most vulnerable. It pushes them further into poverty, limits their opportunities, creates this breeding ground for resentment and despair, which sadly can make them more susceptible to those very extremist ideologies we're talking about.
It's a tragic cycle, and it's something we see all too often in regions affected by conflict and instability.
Unfortunately, yes.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked stats, we've talked political calculations, but at the end of the day, this is about real people. People whose lives are being shattered by this violence.
Right, we can't lose sight of the human cost. We're talking about families torn apart by loss, children who witnessed unspeakable horrors, entire communities living in a constant state of fear.
It's just heartbreaking.
The trauma inflicted by the TTP's actions is immeasurable.
We mentioned earlier how some communities are being targeted more than others. The Hazara Shiites, for instance.
Right, they've been subjected to horrific violence.
But they're not the only ones facing this persecution, are they?
No, sadly they're not. The TTP has this long history of targeting minorities, ethnic groups, anyone who doesn't fit into their narrow worldview. They attack schools, hospitals, places of worship, even funerals.
It's indiscriminate violence, really.
It is. They want to sow fear, they want to divide people, and ultimately they want to force their ideology on everyone else.
It's a chilling reminder of the dark side of extremism, and we can't forget that even efforts to fight back against the TTP to counter their attacks can sometimes have unintended consequences for innocent civilians.
Absolutely. It's a difficult balance, trying to protect people while also trying to neutralize the threat.
It's a tricky situation, no doubt, and this brings us back to that idea of intersectional security, how different forms of insecurity overlap and compound each other.
Right, they're all interconnected. When a school is destroyed, it's not just an attack on education. It's an attack on human security, economic security, cultural security all at once.
Like a ripple effect, just spreading outward.
Exactly. And we talked about how women are particularly vulnerable in this situation. Their lives, their rights, their very existence are under threat from the TTP's ideology. Can you elaborate on that? Give us some specific examples of how women are being impacted.
I mean, imagine being a young girl who dreams of becoming a doctor, a teacher, anything, only to be told you're forbidden from going to school. Or being a woman forced to wear a burqa, cover her face, denied the freedom to express herself, to even walk down the street without fearing harassment or violence.
It's like they're trying to erase their identities, their voices, their very presence in society.
It's a systematic attempt to confine them to a life of subservience.
Exactly. The TTP views women as possessions, as object to be controlled and subjugated. They're denied basic rights, their movements are restricted, their access to education and healthcare is limited, and they live under this constant threat of violence.
It's a stark reminder of why it's so important to fight for gender equality and women's rights, not just in Pakistan, but everywhere. These aren't just abstract concepts, they're fundamental human rights that deserve to be protected and upheld no matter where you are.
I completely agree. And empowering women isn't just about fairness or some abstract ideal. It's fundamental to peace and security. When women are educated, when they have opportunities, when their voices are heard, societies are more stable, more prosperous, and more resilient to extremism.
So we've got this incredibly complex web of interconnected security challenges with the TTP pulling at every strand, creating this chaos and suffering. And lurking in the background, we have the Afghan Taliban, this powerful force that seems to be playing both sides.
They're definitely a wild card in this whole situation.
And that's precisely where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
We'll try to untangle the Afghan Taliban's role, explore why they seem so hesitant to crack down on the TTP, and what that means for the future of peace and security in the region.
It's like a puzzle within a puzzle, trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together.
And we'll attempt to solve that puzzle next time.
All right, welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive into the TTP's resurgence. It's been a pretty intense journey so far, hasn't it?
It has. We've really gone deep into the rabbit hole, exploring the impact of this resurgence on everything from Pakistan's political scene to the lives of everyday people.
And let's not forget about that big elephant in the room, the Afghan Taliban. Their role in this whole situation is like trying to follow a recipe where someone keeps swapping out ingredients.
Right. It's a constant curveball.
Last time we left off with that big question, why is the Afghan Taliban, this supposedly reformed, more moderate group, so hesitant to crack down on the TTP? What's the deal with that?
Well, it's a tangled web of pragmatism, ideology, and a whole lot of historical baggage, frankly.
Yeah.
Remember, the Afghan Taliban and TTP have deep roots. They share a common ideological vision. For them to turn on the TTP now would be like, I don't know, disowning a family member.
It'd be a pretty messy breakup.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not just about ideological solidarity. The Afghan Taliban's walking a tightrope here. They're trying to consolidate their own power, gain legitimacy on the international stage, and rebuild their country after decades of war. Alienating the TTP, which is a powerful force within Afghanistan, could spark internal conflict and really undermine their fragile grip on power.
So they're trying to play it safe, appease the TTP, while also trying to convince the world they're not harboring terrorists.
It's a delicate balancing act, that's for sure.
But this see no evil, hear no evil approach has consequences, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It creates instability, undermines Pakistan's efforts to counter the TTP, and basically sends a signal to other extremist groups that, hey, Afghanistan's open for business.
It's a risky game that could backfire on everyone involved.
No doubt.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, this whole tangled web of security threats with the Afghan Taliban holding a lot of the strings. But the million-dollar question is, what can be done about it? Is there a way out of this mess?
It's not a simple fix, that's for sure. There's no magic bullet to make the TTP disappear or to force the Afghan Taliban's hand. But there are potential paths forward, strategies that could help mitigate the threat and hopefully steer things in a more peaceful direction.
Okay, I'm listening. Give us some hope here.
Well, first and foremost, we need a multi-pronged approach. Think of it like a doctor treating a patient with a complex medical condition.
Okay, I like where this is going.
You need a combination of therapies, right?
Right.
Addressing the symptoms while also tackling the underlying causes.
So what's the treatment plan for this particular ailment? What's the prescription?
One key ingredient is diplomacy. Engaging with the Afghan Taliban, setting clear expectations, making it crystal clear that harboring terrorist groups will have consequences. It's about finding those pressure points, those areas where we can exert some leverage to change their behavior.
But you mentioned earlier that they're worried about internal backlash. Wouldn't cracking down on the TTP just risk pushing them closer to more hardcore factions within the Taliban? It seems like a delicate situation.
It is a risk, definitely. That's why diplomacy needs to be combined with other strategies. Things like targeted sanctions against TTP leaders and their financial networks, sharing intelligence to disrupt their operations, supporting regional efforts to counter their influence. It's about squeezing them from all sides, making it harder for them to operate, and hopefully incentivizing the Afghan Taliban to see cooperation as the less risky path.
So basically, make it more trouble than it's worth for them to support the TTP.
Exactly.
But what about addressing the root causes of this whole extremism problem? We can't just play whack-a-mole forever, right?
You're absolutely right. Long-term stability requires addressing those underlying factors that push people towards groups like the TTP in the first place.
Things like poverty, lack of education, limited opportunities, that feeling of being marginalized and left behind.
Exactly. It's about building a more just and equitable society, a society where people feel like they have a stake, where they have a future, where they're not driven to desperation and violence.
Where there's hope.
Exactly. And that means investing in education, promoting economic development, strengthening governance, making sure everyone feels like they have a voice and a place. It's a long-term, multi-generational project, but it's really the only way to break this cycle of violence.
And what about the international community? Can they play a role in all of this?
They can, and they absolutely should. This isn't just a regional issue. It has global implications. Supporting Pakistan's counterterrorism efforts, providing humanitarian assistance, encouraging dialogue and reconciliation, working to stabilize Afghanistan, these are all areas where the international community can make a real difference.
It sounds like a monumental task, requiring a ton of commitment and cooperation on a global scale.
It is, but the alternative is unthinkable, right? Allowing the TTP to thrive, watching the region descend into chaos, that's just not an option.
We have to...
We do. We have a responsibility to act, to work together, and create a more peaceful and just world for everyone.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the TTP's resurgence, the web of security challenges, the potential paths forward. It's a complex, often disheartening picture, but
there's hope, right?
there is.
There is. Even in the midst of all this, there are glimmers of hope. There are people and organizations working tirelessly for peace, communities coming together to resist extremism, and there's a growing recognition that we need a more holistic, collaborative approach to security. It's not a lost cause, not by a long shot.
That's reassuring to hear.
But it's a cause that requires our attention, our engagement, and our commitment. We have to be willing to think critically, to challenge assumptions, to have those tough conversations.
And ultimately, it reminds us that security isn't just about military force or political maneuvering. It's about human dignity. It's about social justice. It's about the well-being of all people.
Beautifully put.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the TTP's resurgence. Hopefully you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. We've explored the challenges, the complexities, the potential solutions. It's an evolving situation, one that demands our attention and our commitment to building a more peaceful and just world. It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise. Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper, because understanding the challenges is the first step towards finding solutions. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.